Hey everybody, Nick here, and I have reviewed some huge and murdery and scary sorts of knives before on the channel, but, well, never anything quite like this. This right here is the Quiet Carry Bandit. Right there, name, oh, that intimidating name even. And I want to thank my viewer Jess for gifting me this knife. He sent it along a long time ago, and because it's been in my permanent collection, it's taken me a while to get to it. But I really do appreciate that, Jess. That's a kind thing, and this is a great little thing. Let's do a quick size comparison. Yeah, this thing is freaking tiny. Sorry, I couldn't resist the... So right here is a ZTO 452CF, another very, very large and murdery sort of knife. This is your Medford Marauder, which is absolutely ridiculous in a variety of ways. Right here is your Spyderco Delica, per the tradition. Your Ontario Rat number 1. The Rat 2 is currently on vacation, on loan to the Birdshot IV channel. And let's see here. Anything else? Yeah, actually, this is the Spyderco Ladybug, which is another sort of small keychain-ish sort of knife. So there you go. And then finally, just quick note, there is no disassembly video for this guy. I suspect that I could take this apart and maybe drop out the blade, but on a backlight, it's just vaguely concerning to me. And there's no other way to take the back half of it apart. I think there's adhesive going on, so I didn't want to try. So that's a shame, but so it is. So let's go on ahead and jump into the good, the great, the bad, and the ugly of this huge, absolutely gigantic murdery blade. Okay, so on the good side, first off, I appreciate the all-metal construction here. The handle on it is titanium, the blade is Aus-8 steel, there's no plastic that I can see, and that's kind of a nice thing, because very often your smaller everyday carry blades, like your Victorinox Classic, up here, size comparison, or your Spyderco Ladybug, tend to have some element of plastic in there. The build quality tends to be, well, it's a cheap keychain knife, so let's put some of that in there. But this is all metal, and I appreciate that very much. Next thing that I like very much is that this is a great size for keychain sort of cutting. It's not going to be a tool that you're going to use for a lot of everyday cutting tasks, but it is perfect for getting into a blister pack, for instance. So popping open the line of tape on the side of a box, or something along those lines. For a lot of your boring everyday carry cuts, this is going to be more than sufficient for it. And the size for it makes a lot of sense for that, actually. You know, I won't say it's God's gift to ergonomics, but it's good enough, and it certainly does the trick for those sorts of cutting. Nice thing. The blade on here is also a nice thing. I love the swedge on this guy very much. That's a nice little thing they could have skipped, but they didn't, and frankly, it makes it better. The grind on this guy is pretty good. I mean, this is a well-done little blade here. It's relatively thin, not very thick behind the edge. I mean, it's not very thick to start with, but yeah, that's pretty impressive there. The other thing I got to comment on is that the steel here is Aus-8, and I'm not a huge fan of Aus-8 steel. Personally, I think generally it's not a stellar choice, given all the other stellar choices on the market. But that said, in a tiny little keychain knife like this, I think it's actually surprisingly a nice choice. Very often, little keychain knives like this are made of, you know, the blade is some kind of Chinesium steel. You can't... is, you know, surgical stainless, that sort of an affair. Whereas on this guy, you're actually getting a named steel, and it's not a bad named steel. And let's face it, this isn't going to be your everyday carry, hard-used sort of tool. Aus-8's more than fine for what you're getting here. Absolutely okay. Next thing I got to point out is that Quiet Carry is going with this 4-dot sort of thing as a motif in their brand overall. If you look at their bigger knife, this is the Quiet Carry Strand, they're using it there as well, and I think it's kind of a beautiful thing. It's a nice, subtle way to remind people that these two products are related, and I hope that carries throughout their lineup. I think it's a very convincing thing, and frankly, I like it a lot more than if they were to use another logo or something like that. This dot motif is nice. This knife is not so murdery, I'll say that much. You know, you can take this guy out in the lunchroom, and you're going to be very hard-pressed to find a coworker who is terrified of it. And that's pretty good. I'm a big fan of that. It's also pretty universally legal. in, Boston and Chicago, all the places with the silliest of silly laws, this is going to be A-OK. And, honestly, it's at that point where even if it doesn't obey the letter of the law, is anybody really going to bother you for this? If this is just hanging on your keychain, a lot of people aren't even going to realize that it's a knife. And so that's pretty great. That said, the TSA will probably still freak out because they like us good and scared. So, whatever. So make sure you take this off your keychain before you fly because it's apparently still enough of a weapon. Moving along there. The keychain, speaking of which, it's got a nice keychain hole on here. You can see that it's actually a relatively thick chunk of metal here. And, I have no real worry that this keychain hole is going to break off or something along those lines. But it's also relatively small. It's unlike, for instance, on your Spyderco Ladybug here, where you have to get the keychain through the entire thickness of the knife. This guy actually seems like it's well thought out as a keychain, so I like that very much. And then finally, I gotta say, this is another thing that Quiet Carry seems to be doing a lot of, is these tight blade fits within the body. And on this guy, I particularly appreciate it just because this would have the tendency to collect a lot of lint and whatnot, riding around in the bottom of your pocket with your keychain or in your purse or whatever. This, having those tight gaps, tends to reduce the amount of lint and the amount of gunk that gets trapped up under the blade. As you remove the blade here, it lifts up anything that goes into that little gap. It's nicely designed in that way. So that's also good. And in fact, that wraps up the good. I like the fact that they've got the relatively small gaps, which will repel lint and gunk and whatnot. The keychain hole on this guy is nice and a lot nicer than some of your relative other options. It's not too terribly intimidating, even to those scared of people. It's got nice 4-dot motif here. It's a decent choice of steel for a tiny little blade like this. It's got a nice little blade. It's perfect size for keychain cutting. And honestly, the all-metal construction is a beautiful thing. Let's talk about what's great. Honestly, what's great about this knife is that it is surprisingly masterfully done. Usually these sorts of keychain knives, nobody really gives a damn about. So they just create something that's knife-ish, they put it on a keychain, they sell it for $10, and they move on. But this guy is well done. For instance, most of these knives are just slip joints, so, you push from behind and they shut. This guy is actually a locking knife. It's using a little lockback system. In order to unlock this knife, you press down here, and that unlocks the blade so you can shut it. That's a neat little trick. Lockbacks are not that uncommon, but most people don't bother to put them in little keychain knives. And so this, as a result, can actually do spine whacking. That's a stupid thing to do with a keychain knife, but in some ways it really isn't. Because if you're using this guy for, say, clamshell packaging, it would be very easy for this guy to accidentally, make a backward. That's nicely done, and it's a great lockback action. I also gotta say, the smoothness of this knife is remarkable for what you're getting here. It's way smoother than, for instance, your little Victorinox Classics, and frankly, than a lot of your other knives out there in the world. And then, like I said, the fact that they bothered to use OS8 steel here is pretty impressive relative to the other keychain markets. So this is really the best made little keychain knife I'm aware of. They really put in a lot of effort, and it's clear that they gave a damn as they were constructing this. So it is constructed, it is designed, it is well put together, and somebody really did give a damn as they were making this knife, and that's really nice to see, and something that could just be a little throwaway for a lot of people. So that's great. It's surprisingly masterfully done. Let's talk about the bad. Not too much bad here. First off, it is not a disassemblable knife, or at least I question that, because there's not a way to get these scales apart here, whatever. Not a huge deal, but it is a little frustrating. Washing this guy out and re-oiling it could be a little bit frustrating. Next thing, the studs on this guy are not ambidextrous, and that seems like a silly thing to point out. I'm not a lefty or anything like that, but on this particular guy, I feel like that would actually be helpful. I feel like there have been a number of occasions where I've wanted to use this guy, and for whatever reason, it wasn't in a position where I could get to the one-thumb stud, and I would have liked to have another one. For something this small, it doesn't necessarily obey ideas of handedness in the classical sense. If you got your keys in your left hand, it would be nice to just be able to pop this guy back out again. Not a huge deal, but that is a little bit ugly. I'm sorry, a little bit bad. It's a little ugly too, but it's not the ugly. Also, the thumb stud here is in the slicing path, which means that if you're trying to do a clamshell package or something like that, you're only going to be able to get about this deep into it. It's not a huge deal, but you are losing, a fifth of the blade there to that. It's kind of necessary evil here, I think. The lockback is a little bit awkward when you're using this guy off of a keychain because it is locking at the very, very back of the knife here. So manipulating this guy one-handed is not a great exercise. You can do it, but it's awkward. I imagine this would be a lot easier if you had this guy on a keychain so that you had something else in your hand here. But as it is, this is kind of a two-handy knife. Again, I'm not really freaking out about that given what this is supposed to be. But there you go. And then finally, ergonomically speaking, this is about as good as you would expect. It's not stellar by any stretch. It's a little square, basically, but it does the trick. And that's really what this is meant to do. It's meant to do the trick. If you're doing a whole day of hard use cutting and you pick this guy, you're an idiot. And this review cannot save you, particularly. But this is just fine for doing what you need to do. So that's the bad. The ergos are okay, but what do you want? The lockback is a little awkward when it's off a keychain. The non-ambidextrous thumb studs feel oddly missing here, and it's not disassemblable, which is not stellar. On the ugly side, there are just two things. First off, the edges of this guy are a little bit overly sharp, and I mean that the inside of the titanium here, this jimping is particularly abrasive, if you will, and even the edges of the blade, the edges of the keychain, all of this whole thing needed a little bit more chamfering. Not a huge issue, but it is kind of ugly. And it does make this feel less pleasant to use. Hopefully this will be worn down by your keychain over the years, but as it is, not a fan of that. The other thing is, I'm not a big fan of the blade being mounted as high in the body as it is. You can see that there's this much in the way of body before you even get to the blade. This is going to make sharpening this guy kind of a pain in the neck, and it makes a lot of cuts a little bit more complicated. So, I don't know. Not the end of the world, but it is a little bit ugly. If anything, I would have preferred the blade to be further down here, but I understand that that's a difficult thing given the lockback. So, there you go. That's the ugly, is that the edges are overly sharp. The entirety, it needs some more chamfering here, and that the blade being as high in the body as it is a little bit awkward on occasion, including visually. But, yeah, there you go. Let's jump into the final conclusions. Look, final conclusions here. This is a neat little tool. In a lot of ways, it's very well built, and it's way more trustworthy than most of the crappy little keychain knives and tools out there. Frankly, I think this is a little bit more trustworthy than the blade on your Victorinox classic little guys here, just in terms of it's a little bit beefier, it locks, it's got a whole lot of things going for it here. So I think it's a great, trustworthy little keychain tool. I also think it's a very nice object. It's nicely designed, it's nicely machined, it's got a nice all-metal sort of construction to it. It's a very nice little affair here. I'm a fan of this as a knife, as a piece of industrial design, as some art. The closest competition to it, I think, is actually going to be a Spyderco Ladybug, and I've compared these two a few times. The price is about the same. You're looking at $39 versus $36, $35, depending on where you're looking at. But, the Ladybug, I will admit freely, is a better cutting tool because it's got a much larger blade, and frankly, the ergonomics as you're cutting with it are a little bit nicer. Actually, a fair bit nicer. The Ladybug is also easier to operate with one hand, but the thing is, it's also a lot bigger. Well, not a lot, but it is bigger by a reasonable margin here. It's also much more plasticky, and it's way more awkward on a keychain because rather than just a thin little loop like this guy has, you have to pass it through the entire chunk there. So this is not a stellar keychain knife, although it is a much better, small but serious cutting tool. The thing is, though, and so if you use a cutting tool on your keychain all the time, every day, this may be a better choice for you. The steel's a little better, too. But the thing is, even though this guy will never stand in for a full-size pocket knife for full-size tasks, it's not like you can be, leaving your Rat 2 at home, or your Rat 1, I suppose, in this case. But it is a very high-end feeling option that you can keep tucked away for occasional use to hand to somebody who might hurt themselves with a bigger blade, or frankly just as a little backup sort of affair for opening packages and little tiny subtle things. So, like I said, it's not a pocket knife in the classical sense, but it is a nice knife. It's high-end feeling, and I think for that purpose, it is a gem. So there you go, your Quiet Carry Bandit. A little huge, a little murdery, but mostly just a great little keychain option, and something you should probably consider. Yeah, we'll zoom back in for you. Anyways, I hope this is interesting, that you make out like a bandit when you pick one of these up, and that you have yourselves an absolutely wonderful rest of your day. Bye now.